All right, well, I have the great delight of chairing this first panel on climate change adaptation in agriculture, food and water systems. The idea of this panel is to think about how our agriculture and food and water systems can be transformed to support, low emission, resilient, sustainable economies. Societies and environments. And we're quite interested in looking at a number of different cases and collaborations from our colleagues, looking at emerging practices and technologies, how they might be able to help us with this work. And so I have four speakers here for this panel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them briefly and then ask each panelist to come up and give us their short presentation of about 7 minutes. And then we will all join for Q&A afterwards. So do get your questions ready. We'll listen to all the panelists first and then questions afterwards. So first to the stage in this panel, I would like to invite Mr. Vincent Hebrail, who has a background in engineering. Vincent has worked for 12 years for the French Ministry of Agriculture on a diverse range of matters. These include plant health, pesticide use, export, Brexit, international trade, agricultural economics, agroecology, environmental performance of farms, sanitary and phytosanitary inspections at the local, national, European and international levels. And this career path has allowed him to gather a large network on these topics. In January 2022, he was appointed as a counsellor at the Embassy of France to Australia, covering agriculture, agri-food, forestry and fisheries for both Australia and New Zealand. And his main lines of work focus on cooperation, market access and globally on enhancing the relationship between France and Australia on agriculture in a mutually beneficial way. Thank you so much, Vincent.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. So it seems to be tricky to use. Yeah, that's well. So once again, thank you very much for hosting me and for the opportunity to present to you some quick insights about France's public policies on reducing the agricultural footprints, which is, of course, one of the main challenges that agriculture is facing nowadays. So what I'm offering is first some quick views on the EU level, then French level, particularly national level, what is happening on a public policy side of things, and to conclude, some brief information about what is happening also at a regional and sector level. And I'll try to wrap it up in 7 to 8 minutes. So on the EU level, the main target has been set in 2021 by the EU Commission as part of the Fit for 55 package. And the target is to reduce by 55% net emissions at the European level by 2030. And of course, the following target by 2050 is to achieve carbon neutrality at the European level, according to the targets of Paris agreements. I must also state that at the European level, other strategies are here to complement Fit for 55. And to name a few, you can find the Farm to Fork strategy, the Green Deal and biodiversity strategies. And they also set, each one of themselves, specific targets, and particularly on the use of inputs. So, for example, the biodiversity strategy and Farm to Fork strategy aim at reducing by halving the use of pesticides by 2030, halving the use of fertilizers by 2030 also, increase the area cropped on organic farming. So this also has a role to play in achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. At the French level then, the main strategy is the low carbon national strategy. It has been set by the French Ministry of the Environment in 2018, if I recall correctly. And the overall target is to achieve carbon neutrality at the national level by 2050. But mainly it sets some guidelines to achieve a low carbon economy. It is all about all the sectors of economy, and specifically on agriculture, it sets two targets, minus 19% by 2030 and minus 46% by 2050. So this is quite general and an overview of what the low carbon national strategy is doing on agriculture. It's not specific to the agricultural sector, but I will give some details about it just a little later. And in this strategy, you also find a general aim at maximizing forestry and carbon sequestration by vegetation. Okay, so to achieve the national strategy targets has been created a specific label, which is called the low carbon label. It is only at the French level, and it works as a preparation to a national carbon market. So how it operates is well, it's not specific to agriculture either, but if I take the example of farmers, so a group of farmers can be interested in implementing specific management practices on farm. So they gather, they try to build a project upon this. The project has to use specific methodologies, which have been validated by the French Ministry of the Environment, and of course have been consolidated and suggested initially by a panel of independent scientists. And then this group of farmers, once the methodologies are ready to be implemented on farm, can suggest and offer the project to the French Ministry of the Environment, which validates the overall projects, estimates the reduction in emissions, and then labels the project as low carbon project. And once this has been achieved, an external investor, for example, a bank or a transport company, can jump in and offer some funding for the project to be implemented, and then will benefit from the carbon units generated under the project. So for the moment, we have around 800 farms involved, and 6 specific methodologies have been validated for the agricultural sector. And to give you an overview of this, they mainly revolve around farm management practices, such as crop management, introducing more legumes in the rotation, for example, genetics improvements of the animal, increasing productivity, planting hedges also around paddocks, so such methods. Another very important initiative launched by France in 2015 at COP21 was the 4 per 1,000 initiative. The aim was to recognize and acknowledge that if you increase by 0.4% every year the carbon storage into the soil, it's supposed to be balancing the increase in emissions of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at a global level. So the aim of this initiative, which is now international, is to promote the carbon storage into the soils with researchers, companies, institutes, and also at a state level. For the moment, Australia is part of this initiative, but not of every committee. So there are 3 committees. The first one is gathering everybody, it's called the Forum. So around 750 partners. This is a consultative body about the global targets of the initiative. There is a separate committee, which is called the Bureau Decision-Making Committee. So Australia is not part of this one. And finally, a scientific and technical committee gathering mainly researchers, I believe 14 of them, trying to define what is the general strategy on scientific basis. And finally, some insights on what is happening in complementary with the national level, because I think it's important also to state, for example, the implication of sectors and also regions in France, particularly as here in Australia, also such strategies are implemented at a state level or sector level. So just to name a few, there is a strategy for the milk and dairy sector. There is one for the wine sector, one for the red meat sector also. And you have a variety of strategies at a more regional level also, like Pays de la Loire, which is west of France. So this is much linked to the political incentive in different territories, but the interest and the opportunity of implementing such strategies at the regional level is, of course, to make them specific to the climate conditions and growing conditions of every territory. And so I must say that not all sectors have the ambition shared here in Australia, for example, to achieve carbon neutrality in a near future. But the main difference that we can find between French and Australian agricultural sector on climate reduction of emissions is the approach between agroecology, which is more implemented in France, revolving around trying to make to achieve sustainable food systems with a deep evolution of cropping and breeding, whereas in Australia, at the moment at least, it is more revolving around technologies such as feed supplements, such as optimization of fertilizers. And I believe this is one explanation of the difference that we can state between our two countries on the ambition of carbon neutrality and carbon reductions in the future. But I will be very happy in the questions to develop further the different approaches between our two countries. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vincent. I think that was an excellent overview to see what France and indeed the EU is up to politically. We're next going to move to an Australian perspective, and then we'll contrast and go down to some of the more sector-based perspectives. Our next speaker is Professor Ruth Nettle, who leads the Rural Innovation Research Group at the University of Melbourne. Ruth's personal research interests include rural workforce development, looking at human transitions in farming and the role of collaborative action in supporting change towards the kind of policies we're talking about here, the role of extension in rural change, learning systems and adaptation, multidisciplinary research, development and extension. And Ruth also provides input into strategic issues facing rural industries in Australia through strategic reviews on human and social capacity, the role of development in the future of research development, and the role of extension. So thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Katherine, and thank you very much for the invitation. And it's an excellent forum for discussing things such as the innovative planet and climate adaptation. And I'm very much inspired, I suppose, Vincent, from your talk about the French approach. And my introduction here, I suppose, is a little bit more at the local scale and what some of the things that are being, I suppose, tried and developed in the Australian context around climate change and climate change adaptation. Just to, oops, sorry. Yeah, thank you. I should wait for the lag. Go back. So just go back. Thank you. Thanks. Because Vincent sort of started the national scale in France, I thought I'd just start a little bit with some of those differences that Vincent brought out for Australia. And that is at the national level, we have some more developing policy, I suppose, since the new government around targets for emissions reduction. But definitely in Australia, there's a lot of difference at the state level. And then, as Vincent described in France, also in Australia, we have different industries taking different approaches and also different territories taking different approaches. And so I suppose what's been happening over the last number of years is, I suppose quite fragmented approaches to emissions reduction, but also new ways to think about adaptation in a climate change context. And so we have this policy environment, but then we have some of the realities that's happening. And I'm focusing, I suppose, a lot on the issues facing southeastern Australia, and we're here in Victoria at the moment. And so what we have from the climate models is not only increasing pressure around increasing temperatures and reduced rainfall, but we have an increase in, I suppose, the prevalence of what we call extreme events. So here, just as snapshots in the diagram on the left-hand side, we have from our Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre a sort of map of what agriculture might look like under 1.5 degrees warming, and a lot of change needing to go on in terms of the agricultural systems happening. On the right-hand side is just one of the many graphs that you see around what's happening in southeastern Australia, is the prevalence of these extreme events and how they're escalating. And while at the moment we're under La Nina conditions in Australia of over 3 years, we had our recent millennial drought that many believe has been a step change of 10 to 12 years in drought in this part of the world. So it's in that context that it is focusing the minds of farmers and policymakers and industry, not only about emissions reduction, but also about adaptation. And so I was just going to give an insight into some of the things that are going on and the methods that are being applied to support adaptation. So many people talk about, the issues, I suppose, with farmers perhaps not recognising climate change in Australia, where I don't see it that way at all. You might not be able to engage in a robust discussion about climate change, but I tell you, you can engage in very robust discussions about risk and about extreme events. And we're having lots of different conversations with farming groups across, particularly Victoria, around these things and what their adaptation strategies are. So I just thought briefly I'd go through two aspects of some responses to these challenges, and that being adaptive governance of efforts in innovation, as well as transdisciplinary approaches. So the first example of adaptive governance is a national program of drought hubs around the country. And so this is an effort through the national government to support a combination of grassroots effort to address climate change and drought challenges at a local level, but bringing together the innovation system to support drought response. And so we have these hubs around the country, and I was up until recently the co-director of the Victoria Hub. And so this is the effort of 5 farming system and industry groups located around the state here in Victoria, with 4 universities, Melbourne, Federation, La Trobe and Deakin universities, as well as the state government. And our, or the mission of the drought hubs is to increase drought resilience at the farm level, at the environment level, and at the community level, and to work on those initiatives together as one, to include Indigenous voices and Indigenous strategies around drought resilience. And so this is, I suppose, an idea that of needing to do that together and collaboratively, and to share decision-making and prioritisation. And so the hubs, or the hub in Victoria, has been going for about a year, where there's a lot of things sort of on the ground, both locally and then strategic thinking about moving towards greater resilience for drought. But even now, people are talking about floods as being part of a financial drought for many systems that are going on. So it's seen as a platform for which some of these really large challenges for these regional areas can be addressed, bringing science and practice together to support greater resilience. So that's one example around a climate change adaptation response from an adaptive governance perspective. The other just wanted to flag was greater efforts in transdisciplinary research that we've been part of, I suppose, that bring modelers together from the biophysical sciences, farmers, communities, to consider not just scenarios for climate change adaptation, but to develop plausible development options for farmers in an area, and really having farmers contribute actively to what those development scenarios could be. So it is about bringing in different knowledges to support changes in practices in terms of adaptation. So just briefly, I suppose some of the features of the approaches that we've used is to form farmer and advisor reference groups around climate change adaptation problems. And in this case, we've been working with the livestock industries, dairy and the red meat sector. And we bring both the biophysical modelling of the farm system with the economic modelling of the farm system, and we have social scientists as well, looking at talking to people and bringing people together around putting forward different scenarios to be modelled and considering what the strengths and weaknesses of those options are for farms in that area. The big focus is not to focus on an optimum or the best solution, but different pathways, and have farmers involved in considering what those pathways are for their region and what might be in their future or not. And this is in a very iterative way and at quite a local scale. However, what we've noticed is that as more and more farmer groups and different industries find out this particular approach, and where particularly farmers say we're not being told what to do, but we're actively participating in what our future might be, we're actually getting requests from different groups to come and apply this approach and methodology and work with the scientists to think about options in different areas. Part of the methodology working with the climate models and the scientists is thinking of parallel locations where future climates might be what someone might be experiencing in one area versus another. And so these trips to the future has been something that the collaborators have really come and supported, where groups of farmers and advisors and people from different regions go to another region that reflects a parallel future climate for them, and gets them talking to the farmers in those areas about things that they might need to consider in their climate future. Just in terms of a connect with INRAE, we have some colleagues that we look, particularly from the agroecological tradition, we look at some of the workforce implications of change. And so we have some informal collaborations with colleagues there in the Science for Action and Development group in different parts of France that we'd really like to build and continue that collaboration. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And I think, again, a really excellent presentation that allowed us to see not only the policies, but the approaches that are being taken in Australia. And I think there are some really good lessons, and we already know that there's a lot of collaboration going on between our two countries around those processes. Our next presenter is Dr. Jean-Francois Hocquette, who's an outstanding class research director working at the Herbivore Research Unit of INRAE. So one of the collaborating partners here. His research interests concern muscle biology as relevant to muscle growth or beef eating quality. He was the leader of the research team Muscle Growth and Metabolism and director of the Herbivore Research Unit about a decade ago. He's been working for the French High Council for Evaluation of Research in Higher Education, and he's now the president of the French Association for Animal Production and scientific officer in charge of international relationships for Australia and New Zealand of INRAE. He also organised the World Congress of Animal Science in Lyon in 2023. Thank you so much, Jean-Francois.
Thanks very much for this kind invitation. So I'm very pleased to discuss the role of livestock about climate change. So as you know, the human population is increasing and we have more and more urban people who know less and less about animal production and about farming system. So the problem to solve is the following. We need to produce more and more proteins, more and more food, and we need in the same time to have a lower footprint of animal production and animal products. And we need also to address social needs in terms of animal welfare and product quality for the consumer. So these challenges, of course, are not new, but the challenge is to combine all these challenges together. Some people claim that it might be a good idea to prepare culture meat by cultivating muscle cells in vitro from a muscle biopsy. It's also possible to combine different culture of different cell types to produce something which looks like a muscle. So this has been proposed as a solution for the future. However, meat is animal flesh that is eaten as food. This is the definition. So of course, proteins from plants, even as processed as food, as a burger, are not meat, and culture muscle cells are not meat, but also muscle fibers, only muscle fibers. And most of the consumers we ask agree with this view that culture meat is not really meat, it's only muscle fibers. So the main drivers of meat consumption in the past were availability of meat, the need to satisfy nutritional needs of our body, and also cultural factors. And today you have more and more drivers of meat consumptions, which are related first to about sensory factors, tenderness, juiciness, flavor, but also cultural and psychological factors, and climate change and concern about climate change are among the main drivers of meat consumption, and especially reduction in meat consumption. And finally, you have, of course, marketing factors such as the price, the brand, the label, and so on. So you can see today that the drivers of meat consumptions are very diverse and very complex compared to the past. So if you look at the main drivers of when you buy food as a consumer, you can see that they differ mainly between China and France, and more generally between different countries. So for instance, in France, you can see that, let's say that sensory analysis are very important, environmental impacts, and also origin and traceability. Whereas in China, the main drivers are related to safety and nutritional value as well. Of course, concerns for environmental impacts are quite significant, but not the first drivers of food purchase. In European countries, meat consumption has decreased, but mainly for health concerns by consumers, but also about due to concerns about livestock practices. Some consumers thinking that it might be unfair to kill animals. So the environmental reasons and concerns are not so important compared to the first one. So the future of the meat market might be complex in the future, with a first branch around agroecology, and I will discuss that further later on. And there is another branch, it might be food tech, with maybe a genetic modified organism, cloned animals, or maybe one day culture meat. So agroecology is something which is highly promoted by France, as Vincent said before, because agroecology takes benefits of biomass recycling to protect the environment. So this is a recycling of organic matter between the soil, the crops, and the grass and forages, which are eaten by farm animals. So this is a recycling between the soil, the plants, the crops, farm animals, and both plants and farm animals produce food for human beings. I have some colleagues which have described the principles of agroecology for sustainable farming systems. So there is a first principle about decreasing the inputs needed for production. There is another principle which is adopting management practices to improve animal health. The third one is relating to the preservation of biological diversity in agro ecosystem by adapting management practices. Another one is about enhancing diversity within systems to strengthen their resilience. And the last one is about decreasing pollution by optimizing the metabolic functioning of farming systems. So in other words, all these systems are based on a better use of natural processes. And you can read basic papers describing all these principles. So in brief, just when you see some herbivores and ruminants, so you have a biodiversity of plants thanks to grazing herbivores. You have also carbon storage in the soil of permanent pastures. So it's natural feeding, and therefore the meat is rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids with health benefits. And you can see that the cows are happy and the landscape beautiful, thanks to the presence of animals here. Another point which is very important is food waste and loss. So food waste and loss are associated to a huge amount of greenhouse gases emissions. So food waste and loss might be the third country after China and US in greenhouse gas emissions. So if you reduce food waste and loss only by half, you will reduce quite a lot greenhouse gas emissions. Another strategy is to have more healthy diets. So it's very clear that in developed countries, we should eat probably less to match our nutritional needs, and we should eat less meat, dairy, and egg products, and we should eat more fruit and vegetables. But these recommendations are opposite in other parts of the world. in which you should eat, people should eat more and more proteins, and so on. So in conclusions, I would like to say that the urbanization of human beings further and further away from rural culture has brought about a decrease in knowledge and acceptance of meat production, making people also less able to express a critical view about livestock and about kosher meat as example. So meat does bring with it positive health, social and historical values. So the future of meat is likely to be more complex, and we should move towards a new farming system based on the principles of agroecology, and we should reduce food waste and loss and change our consumption habits. So all these topics will be discussed at the World Congress of Animal Science, which is supposed to gather maybe 2,000 delegates in Lyon, end of 2023. I would like to finish this talk by saying that many scientists in animal science complain because there are many fake news in the press media. So about 150 scientists working in animal science met together in Dublin a few weeks ago, and they complain about this fake news, and they want to promote fair and honest science about livestock. So there is the Dublin Declaration, and almost 500, today maybe 600 scientists have signed this declaration. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jean-Francois. Great to get into the depths of a sector to look at food and livestock and meat. I know with some of my own environmental policy students, thinking about those things in complex ways can be a challenge, and particularly in Australia where we have many pest animals, it would be good to eat them rather than, you know, importing things from other places. All right. Our last speaker, we're now moving to the water sector. Many interesting similarities here. I would like to present Dr. Lisa Ehrenfried, who is the Manager for Environment and Community Resilience at Yarra Valley Water here in Victoria. In this role, which she also shares with another part-time worker, she leads the development and drives the implementation of Yarra Valley Water's climate resilience plan, circular economy strategy, and community and environment resilience work. Her previous roles include Manager for Research and Innovation at the Water Services Association of Australia and in Integrated Water Planning in the Victorian State Government. Lisa has a Master's in Mechanical Engineering from the Technical University of Munich and a PhD in Materials Science from the University of Cambridge. And I know she also speaks French, and we're happy to have a conversation with you afterwards. So thank you so much, Lisa.
Fantastic. I'm very pleased to speak to you today from Yarra Valley Water. Those who are not from Melbourne, Yarra Valley Water is the largest water retailer. We service the northern and eastern suburbs of Melbourne, about 2 million customers and 20,000 kilometres of water and sewer pipes are in our remit. Today, I want to give you, as I've been said, an overview of what we're doing in climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, and then also touch on the underpinning philosophy of it. In our 2030 strategy, you can see it here. It's all about, yes, we want to support the health and well-being of our customers and the environment. And we have three, we call them pillars to that strategy around transforming around the customers, helping communities thrive. And what I'll dive into today a bit more is the environment pillar. So talking about beyond zero carbon, circular economy and healthy ecosystems that we've really recognized as some key areas where we can do more for the environment. Starting with beyond zero carbon, we've developed a strategy that will see Yarra Valley Water to be net zero by 2025. meaning that 100% of our electricity demand would come from renewables. Also, of course, we look at productivity, where can we be more energy efficient in our processes, and then where we can't either reduce or avoid or use renewable energy, it's about offsetting the carbon that we create. How do we do that? One example is here on the left. We've got a food waste to energy plant that's adjacent to a sewer treatment plant out in Wollert in the northern area of Melbourne. That food waste to energy plant takes in 33,000 tons of food waste that comes from manufacturing sites like food manufacturers, and is then turned into 8.6 million kilowatt hours of renewable energy. That energy is used to power the adjacent sewer treatment plant, or is also exported to the grid. Now, very soon, we hope to have another use of that renewable energy that we produce on site. We're just building up a hydrogen pilot on the plant site. So we take in some of the recycled water from the sewer treatment plant, split it up into a hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen can then be exported for gas for in the local gas grid. And the oxygen is quite interesting. That could potentially then also be used back in the sewer treatment process, where oxygenation really helps with the treatment of the water. We also have on our office site, we've got a solar car park. So it's very handy, your car can park in the shade while also collecting sun rays, and also to then charge the increasing fleet of electric vehicles that we have at Yarra Valley Water. In circular economy, I just touched on the main headings here, that the strategic objectives are to close the loop on water through, for example, increasing water efficiency, finding new ways of recycling water, minimizing waste. That includes the food waste to energy plan that we have, but also looking at the office construction waste. How can we have a better impact here? And reusing spoil. So when there is an emergency breakage somewhere, we have to, dig out a lot of the soil to access the pipe. But at the moment, we're not allowed to then reuse it, or also we can't reuse it on site. Sometimes it's very soggy soil, so you wouldn't want to reuse it. So we have to truck that out to landfill and buy new soil to fill the hole again. So we're thinking on what can we do to reuse that material. And then conserving resources, that's in particular in the construction process. There is a lot of embedded energy, as you might imagine, in constructing pipes. There's the pipe itself, there's the aggregate that sits around the pipe, and that all has a big carbon footprint. So we're looking at what are alternative materials that we could use. For example, we can use an aggregate that's, rather than coming fresh from the quarry, is made from construction rubble that's then sieved for the right sizes and used in that way. Healthy ecosystems, we've done an assessment of 190 sites that we have at Yarra Valley Water, and we found that a third of them have a biodiversity value. And we even have some sites where there is some threatened species in the vicinity, and we're currently restoring one site around our Upper Yarra treatment plant that we're restoring to then hopefully become a release site for the helmeted honeyeater and lowland land-meter possums, both of which are threatened species in Victoria. We're working closely together with Zoos Victoria and Greening Australia in that project. Now to climate resilience. A few months back, we released the climate resilience plan, and it really captures what we're doing both in mitigation and adaptation as an organization, what we're doing already, and also what's happening in the coming 5 years. It was really interesting in the creation of that plan to work with the entire organization and understand how much of what we actually are already doing contributes to climate resilience. Some say water efficiency programs. Some people were looking at that more from a, oh, let's save customers the water bills. Let's reduce water consumption overall, so our reservoirs are always nice and full. It's not a problem at the moment, but the next drought is just around the corner. So really understanding what's happening in the entire organization in that space. And we identified a number of focus areas that we want to look at. I'm not going to dive into them in more detail, but it includes things like climate resilience assessment of our assets. It's working with our maintenance managers in how we can take in the insights. So from Bureau of Meteorology, we get their quarterly forecasts, water outlook, and then plan our maintenance programs around that, because we can often expect, say, more breakages if it's a very dry spell. That takes me to the regenerative approach. Regenerative thinking is something that's come to our organization fairly recently. We started out as an organization saying, oh, our relationship with the environment let's just follow what the regulator wants us to do and thereby minimize our impact. Then it was a view of, let's go a bit beyond that and think about how could we minimize our impact a bit more. And we started looking at renewable energy and these sorts of things. But then the natural next step is really to look at regeneration. And yes, there we go. And with regenerative thinking, the big question we're asking now is not how can we be less bad to the environment, but really also thinking about where can we do more good for the environment? With the example that I had with the treatment plant. In the past, it would have been, oh, how much do we have to treat the sewage to be acceptable for the environment? But now it's questions like, well, this site, that treatment plant site, how can it do more good for the environment? And that creates things like the opportunity to create new habitat for those certain species, or the opportunity of using the site, around the treatment plant now, where we, at a different plant, where we're looking at creating a community farm. So we're working together with Whittlesea Community Connections. They're bringing in refugees, people who would struggle otherwise to find employment, and bring them in to use the recycled water and use the site of the farm itself to then grow some seedlings that can be used in the Northern Growth area. So it's really looking at our assets that we have and then questioning, well, could this asset deliver more than just the engineering function that it started out with? And that's kind of thinking we want to bring more and more across the engineers in our organization. And you can get to that kind of thinking through, rather than just, as I said, focusing on the function, you think about the entire system, much more a whole of systems approach. What is this particular asset interacting with? A pipe track, which is, you often see it in the suburbs. It's just a stretch of grass, like this weird little long grassy area that people walk their dogs on. It's usually because there's a pipe underneath it that you need to access in emergencies. But does this pipe track have more of a potential than just being this stretch of grass for the dogs to use? We now started looking at, well, maybe we could plant some meadows on that grass. So at least the bees that are under increasing threat, they've got more space to thrive on. And it's really a fascinating way to think more and more and differently about our assets and how they can be used. Collaboration is absolutely critical. It's collaboration with community groups, collaboration with researchers also, collaboration with, say, Zoos Victoria in the case of the habitat restoration. So it's really thinking much more broadly about what our assets can do. So you think about the potential of what it could achieve rather than just the function that you really need it to fulfill. There is a picture here of, you might want to guess what that is, that building. It's a sewer treatment plant. And a sewage treatment plant. So it's this particular project. It started out as one where they said, we really need this plant in this particular location, but the community, of course, they were not very excited about it. They did not want to have a sewage treatment plant in their vicinity. So they engaged regenerative practitioners to think about this sewage treatment plant in a different way and approach it in different angles. And now they design this beautiful wetland, and it's a community asset now rather than a liability or a nuisance. And people still complain about it, but now they're complaining about the fact that there's not enough car parks around the site because they really enjoy going there and visiting on their weekends. Now I might just skip the next example that I had, but I do want to finish on this quote. It's a quote by Paul Hocquette. You might want to look him up. He is really an expert and in regeneration as well. He's got the largest list of projects and solutions that help with the climate crisis. And he says, from the planet's point of view, there's really no difference between a climate denier and someone who understands the problem and does nothing. And that's really what drives us at Yarra Valley Water at the moment, seeing what else we can do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And I think it's another beautiful example of the how and how some of our industry partners in Australia are going about embedding these kinds of challenges into their daily practices. Can I ask all of our speakers to come up to the panel now? And we've got time for some Q&A. I'll also get Paul to monitor online in case there are questions there. And I might come and sit down with you. So do we have questions? Any questions? Yes, over there. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. Wendy Pollard, soon to be a doctor at Swinburne, hopefully in a fortnight's time. Where do I start? Well, it's primarily directed to the first three speakers. I failed to hear the word organics. I did hear sustainability. As a 40-year-old vegetarian, I didn't hear anything about vegetarianism, which could have fitted in. My thesis is on worldwide opportunities on organic farms, Australia. Now, WOLF is a worldwide movement, and within the principles, those 5 principles the third speaker mentioned, WOLF embodies all those principles, so that was a positive that I heard. But what I would like to know, primarily from the 3 first speakers, because the 4th one, well, there's a lot of issues in water and Yarra water. Anyway, where do you think the WOLF movement, worldwide opportunities on organic farms, could basically fit into what you're espousing?
Right, is there someone who would like to respond to that one? Jean-Francois?
If I understood well your questions, you are asking about organic farming?
Yes.
Yes.
Primarily, yes.
Yes.
You did bring up the 5 principles.
Yeah. So in France, the French beef industry would like to have, let's say, half of its production under the label organic farming to promote organic farming in France. And there is a high demand of products like this.
Any other comments, Ruth?
Yes, very much. I'm very familiar with the woofers. Definitely, you asked about the roles that they play. I think as the main avenue is the provision of work in these systems, as well as many other things. So I think that sort of approach has a major role in the future, because it is through sharing knowledge and ideas and people moving and working in different systems that is part of adaptive strategies. So there was definitely no other reason to not mention organics or other things, but I think overall movements such as those are an important aspect of the changes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you again. Thanks for your question. From a French government perspective, there is a strategy on increasing the area under organic farming, indeed. But also, I believe we try to favor a good combination of every approach in farming. And I believe we had a very vivid debate about soil conservation agriculture in the past years. It's a method with no tilling, so it's good for the soils, but it needs glyphosate at the moment, which is, of course, non-compatible with organic farming. This is at least the view of French farming sector. So I believe the strategy overall is to try to achieve sustainability by combining different levels of action, and organic farming is one of them.
Thanks so much. Are there further questions? Yes.
So François Aguet from the University of Sydney. So just to follow on this point, because farming takes energy. So organic farming is not necessarily the answer to things. The real question is how efficient farming can become in using less energy. And around that also is also the issue of adaptability that you rightly mentioned, but you talk about the extreme drought and flooding. But we know that through climate change also seasons are going to vary. So how farmers are going to adapt?
Thanks, François. Anyone like to respond?
Not necessarily, I don't know about energy, but just to quick remark on this. This leads to the, well, we need good methods for diagnostics on carbon agroecosystems. And so the way energy is used, where do emissions come from? And from there, designing proper levers for reducing emissions and indeed more efficient use of energy. And I believe one of the leading matters on this could be more international cooperation about setting standards on measuring sustainable performance of systems.
So if I may, maybe to correct the energy issue, for example, fertilizer, it's energy. So are you continue with an intensive farming without fertilizer?
Thanks. I might just take that as a comment and we'll continue that afterwards. I'm just going to give some time to our other speakers.
Yes, so in terms of adaptation, we promote also livestock farming systems with more adapted breeds, local breeds, or we call that rustic breeds, which are well adapted to local environment. So we are in the process to promote some local breeds and robust breeds, which are more adapted to variations in climate and things like that.
Just briefly, from an energy perspective, I know that I'm not an energy expert at all, but there's been a real emphasis on individual farm energy audits. So it's definitely focusing the mind in Australia of many farmers, and this is one of the mechanisms that they can look at their own systems and go into more renewables, etc. So that's one initiative. On the adaptation side, I think it's a really important aspect in our work. You know, there's obviously operational decisions, tactical decisions, and strategic decisions that are being made at the farm level, and adaptation is happening at each of those. So at the moment, a lot of the sectors are thinking more about the strategic decision making. Where actually are the farm systems going? Should they get out of different production systems? That, you know, there is really support and adaptation needed at all those levels of decision making.
Maybe just one last comment on the question you had on fertilizer needing a lot of energy. At the food waste to energy plant that I spoke about before, we do have a product that comes out of it at the end, digestate. At this point in time, we're not yet, I hope to say, allowed to make it available as a fertilizer product, but we're working with the EPA on it. Yeah, it's just the regulations that stop us.
Thank you so much. Very, very quick question.
Okay, just a very quick question. Jean-Paul Toutin from CNRS. A question about societal impact. You are talking about new net zero farming. What about the societal impact? I'm thinking about the 1,000 cows in France, and which generate a huge opposition from the traditional farming system in France. And is the societal impact something that you are working on?
Yes, of course, we are studying social impacts. And so livestock farming systems are assessed according or considered according to 5 pillars. So inputs, of course, we discussed that. The production of meat and dairy products, so economy. The third pillar is environmental issues, as you know. There is another one, which is, let's say, the social impact, which include gastronomy, animal welfare, things like that, and the history of or habits to eat this type of foods and so on. And the last one is the jobs, so employment, direct and indirect employments. So we assessed our livestock farming systems according to these 5 pillars together.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Indeed, good questions. Well, of course, in France, the strategy of the government is most of the time consulted with stakeholders, including farmers and including representatives of the social groups. So I believe such issues as the 1,000 cows farm indeed are raised very often and are taken into account in policies. I believe in the last years, the government has tried to spread a message about this public decisions being more and more based on science and less on emotion and such social issues raised indeed by groups of people. And well, the agroecology approach might be a solution to this, as it promotes evolution towards more inclusive and more sustainable food systems, including the impact on society. So yeah, I believe this might be one of the long-term replies and answers to this.
And at I suppose a smaller scale, but part of the transdisciplinary approach that I described includes consideration of the social impacts, both at an individual farm level, as well as what people see in the different adaptation responses being for their region and for their environment as well. Yeah, so it's having these approaches to incorporate some of the social impacts at that level, as well as being considered in the Australian methods.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for this panel. I think we've been able to talk across levels of policy and governance and practice and sectors and local scale, and bring together many different complex factors and interests that are at play in this climate adaptation area. I would like you to join in thanking all of the speakers here, and please continue discussion with them after this. Thank you so much.